My husband didn't hesitate when he said it. I love your stepmother. I choose her. He stood there in our kitchen like he was announcing something ordinary. Something already decided. Not asking. Not even explaining. Just stating it. As if 10 years of marriage could be reduced to a single sentence and filed away like paperwork. I remember the exact details in a way that still unsettles me. The soft hum of the refrigerator behind him. The faint smell of coffee still lingering from earlier that evening. The way the light from above cast a shadow across his face, making him look almost unfamiliar. Not angry, not guilty, just relieved. And then he added something that felt colder than the confession itself. I've already taken care of the finances. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. I thought it was just another attempt to make things sound clean, controlled, manageable. Like he was trying to package betrayal into something efficient. 2 days later, I found out exactly what he meant. Most of our shared money was gone. Not spent. Not lost. Moved. And just like that, he filed for divorce. No argument. No discussion. Just a quiet, calculated exit. At least, that's what he believed it was. What Kevin didn't know, what neither he nor Hannah could have predicted, was that this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of everything falling apart for them. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even ask him to repeat what he'd just said. I stood there, across from him, with my hands resting lightly on the kitchen counter, and I listened. That's what I remember most. Not reacting, just listening, because something in me had already shifted. Not broken, shifted. There's a difference. Kevin was still talking, saying something about how this had been building for a while, how he hadn't meant for it to happen this way, how he thought it would be better if we handled things like adults. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't need to. Every word he said felt rehearsed, measured, like he had practiced this conversation somewhere else, with someone else, before bringing it to me. That was the first thing that told me this wasn't sudden. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. He leaned back slightly against the counter, crossing his arms, waiting for a reaction that never came. I could feel it, the expectation hanging in the air between us. He was waiting for tears, for anger, for something he could respond to. But I didn't give him anything. Instead, I watched him. I noticed how he avoided looking directly at me when he mentioned Hannah's name, how his voice stayed steady, almost too steady. When he talked about the future, how he kept using words like clean and simple, as if those words could soften what he had already done. Because even then, before I had seen the accounts, before I had opened a single statement, I knew something else had already happened. People don't leave like that unless they've already prepared to. I don't want this to be messy, he said at one point, his tone shifting slightly, like he was trying to sound reasonable. We can divide things fairly. I've already spoken to someone. Of course he had. That part didn't surprise me. What stayed with me was something else he said, almost casually, like it didn't matter. You'll be fine. I remember that sentence more clearly than anything else. Not because it was comforting. Because it wasn't. It was dismissive. Final. Like he had already calculated exactly what I was worth without him. I nodded once. Slowly. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. That was the only reaction I gave him. Then I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't slam the door. I didn't rush. I walked at the same pace I always did. Down the hallway. Up the stairs. Into the bedroom that suddenly didn't feel like mine anymore. I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. That's when I started thinking, not about what he had said, about what he had already done. Because somewhere between I love her and I've taken care of the finances, something else had been revealed. Something quieter, but far more dangerous. This wasn't just a man leaving his wife. This was a man who had already rearranged his life before telling me it was over. And I didn't know how far that rearrangement went. Not yet. But I was going to find out, because in that moment, sitting there in the dark, I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. I didn't need to understand his feelings. I needed to understand his actions. And for the first time since he had spoken those words, I felt something steady settle inside me. Not grief. Not anger. Focus. The kind that doesn't rush. The kind that doesn't react. The kind that waits. I stood up, walked over to my desk, and opened my laptop. Not to message him. Not to call anyone. Just to look. Because whatever he thought he had taken care of, I had a feeling he hadn't taken care of everything. And I was done being the woman who trusted what she couldn't see. Nothing in the house had changed by morning. The same quiet kitchen. The same coffee machine blinking patiently. The same sunlight slipping through the blinds like it always had. And yet nothing felt the same. I stood there for a while longer than usual, holding a mug I hadn't taken a sip from, listening to the silence like it might explain something to me. It didn't, because the truth was already there. It had just finally been said out loud. Kevin had already left. Not physically. Not yet. But everything that mattered, his attention, his loyalty, his decisions, had already shifted somewhere else long before he stood in that kitchen and told me. For years, I believed we had built something real. Not perfect. Not passionate in the way movies like to pretend love should be. But steady. Functional. The kind of relationship people quietly admire because it lasts. We had routines. Reliable ones. Saturday mornings at the same grocery store. Always starting with coffee from the cafe near the entrance. Sunday evenings where we both worked quietly in the same room. Him on his laptop. Me sketching or reviewing designs. Weekdays that followed a rhythm so predictable it felt safe. We didn't have to ask where the other person was. We already knew. That was what I thought stability looked like. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, mostly from home. My schedule was flexible, but my income wasn't uncertain. I contributed to the mortgage, the bills, the renovations. I chose our furniture. I redesigned the kitchen myself 2 years ago. Piece by piece. Late nights and careful decisions. It wasn't just his life. It wasn't just our life. It was mine, too. And Kevin had always known that. He wasn't reckless. That's what made all of this harder to process. He was structured, logical, careful with decisions. A software engineer who planned everything in layers, who liked predictability, who didn't take risks unless he understood the outcome. He didn't lose control. He made choices. That distinction mattered more than I was ready to admit. When my father remarried, everything shifted in a way I never fully addressed. Hannah entered our lives quietly. But she didn't stay on the edges for long. She was only a few years older than me. Confident. Polished. The kind of woman who always seemed to know exactly how to speak in any situation. Her background in digital marketing showed in everything she did, how she presented herself, how she carried conversations, how she positioned people around her. At first, I kept a polite distance. Not hostility. Not resentment. Just distance. It was strange. Having someone so close to my age suddenly become part of my family in that role. But I adjusted, or at least, I thought I did. My father changed after he married her. Not drastically. Just enough that I noticed. Conversations became shorter, less frequent. When we did talk, they felt filtered, as if something was always just outside the conversation, something I wasn't being included in. Hannah was always there in the background. Sometimes literally, sometimes in the way decisions were already made before I heard about them. I told myself it was normal. People move on. Families evolve. But there were moments I didn't ignore completely. I just didn't know what they meant. Hannah started appearing more often in our lives. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual. Easy to justify. Holiday dinners became more frequent. Casual drop-ins started happening without much notice. Small favors turned into longer visits. Conversations stretched late into the evening. Kevin got along with her easily. Too easily. Maybe. He helped her with technical things at first. Fixing something on her laptop. Setting up accounts. Explaining systems she said she didn't understand. It made sense. That was his field. And she appreciated it in a way that felt amplified. Compliments that lasted a little too long. Laughter that carried just a second too far. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But noticing isn't the same as understanding. There were small moments I remember now with a clarity I didn't have back then. The way Kevin laughed around her. Not louder. Not more often. Just differently. Looser. Like he didn't have to think about it. The way Hannah would sometimes answer a question I had directed at Kevin. And he would let her. The way conversations would pause, just briefly, when I entered the room. Nothing you could point to. Nothing you could accuse. Just something. And that was the problem. Because I trusted structure more than instinct. 10 years of consistency felt like proof. Like evidence that whatever I thought I was noticing couldn't be what it looked like. People don't risk everything for something like that. That's what I believed. Looking back, I understand how dangerous that belief was. Because time doesn't protect you. It hides things. I remember one evening in particular, we were all sitting outside on the back patio. It was late. The air cool. The kind of quiet night where conversations drift instead of focus. Hannah was telling a story about a client she had worked with. Kevin interrupted her halfway through, finishing her sentence before she could. She laughed. Not surprised. Not confused. Like she already knew what he was going to say. I remember smiling at the time. It seemed harmless. Familiarity. That's what I called it. Now I know better. Familiarity doesn't happen like that without time. Without repetition. Without something building underneath it. From the outside, we looked exactly the same. A stable couple. A functional family. Nothing dramatic. Nothing broken. But inside that structure, something had already started to shift. And I had been standing right in the middle of it, choosing not to see it clearly. Because seeing it would have meant asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. And trusting instincts I wasn't ready to believe. By the time Kevin said the words in that kitchen, none of it was new. It was just finally undeniable. And the hardest part wasn't realizing what had happened. It was realizing how long it had been happening, without me truly seeing it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. That was the first thought that stayed with me the morning after everything had been said out loud. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, not really looking at anything, just letting my mind replay moments I had once dismissed. They didn't feel random anymore. They lined up, quietly. Precisely. There had been a pattern. I just never called it that. Kevin's schedule had shifted months ago. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Project deadlines, new responsibilities, late meetings. That's what he told me. But now, looking back, the timing didn't hold. The late nights weren't consistent with his actual workload. The explanations were always just vague enough to avoid detail, but clear enough to sound believable. And his phone. That was the first real change I should have taken seriously. Kevin had never been protective of his phone before. It used to sit face up on the coffee table. Within reach. Without concern. We weren't the kind of couple who checked each other's devices. But we also weren't the kind who hid them. Then, slowly, that changed. It started with small things. Taking it with him when he stepped out of the room, turning it face down during dinner, carrying it into the bathroom. At the time, I told myself it didn't mean anything. Now, it meant everything. I remember one moment clearly. I had asked him something simple, what time he thought he'd be home the next evening. Nothing serious. Just planning. He paused for half a second longer than usual. Then he answered. But it wasn't the answer that stayed with me. It was the way he said it. Slightly sharp. Slightly defensive. Like I had asked the wrong question without knowing it. That was the first time I felt something shift. Not enough to accuse. Not enough to confront. But enough to notice. Hannah's behavior had changed. Too. Not in obvious ways. Not in ways anyone else would question. She was simply more present. More involved in our lives. More comfortable in our space. She showed up more often. Stayed longer. Asked Kevin for help more frequently. even when the problems she described didn't sound complicated enough to need him specifically. And when she spoke to him, there was a tone I didn't recognize at first. Familiar. Not polite. Not formal. Familiar. I told myself that was natural. She was family. But there's a difference between familiarity and closeness. And I hadn't realized they were crossing that line. There was something else. Too. Something harder to explain. The way they looked at each other. It wasn't obvious. Not the way you might expect. There were no lingering stares or obvious signals. It was subtler than that. A shared glance. A pause before responding. A reaction that happened just slightly too quickly. Like they were already in sync before anyone else caught up. I remember one evening when all three of us were sitting in the living room. Hannah said something about a project she was working on. Before she could finish explaining it, Kevin nodded and said, "Yeah, I know what you mean. He shouldn't have." She hadn't explained it yet. They both stopped for a second. Just a second. Then she laughed it off, filled in the explanation, and the moment passed. But it didn't pass for me. Not completely. There was a dinner a few weeks later that felt off. We were at the table, eating, talking about nothing important. At some point, Kevin stood up and said he needed to grab something from the kitchen. Hannah followed him a minute later, saying she wanted more water. It wasn't unusual, except they were gone longer than necessary. When they came back, everything seemed normal. Too normal. Kevin resumed his seat like nothing had happened. Hannah picked up the conversation exactly where she had left off. But there was a shift in the air. Subtle. Almost invisible. Except I felt it. And I didn't know why. I tried asking Kevin about it once. Not directly. Just lightly. "You and Hannah seem to be getting along really well lately," I said. He smiled. But it didn't reach his eyes. "She's family," he said. "That's kind of the point." It sounded reasonable. It always did. That was the problem. Every explanation he gave made sense on its own. But together, they didn't. That's what I started to understand. Individually, each moment was harmless. Together, they formed something else. Something I hadn't been willing to name. I stopped bringing it up after that. Not because I was convinced everything was fine. Because I wasn't. But I didn't have anything solid. A feeling isn't evidence. And I wasn't ready to accuse my husband and my stepmother based on something I couldn't prove. So I did something else. I stopped talking. And I started watching. It was a quiet shift. No announcement. No decision I could point to. Just a gradual withdrawal from the version of myself that trusted automatically. I paid attention to timing. To patterns. To small inconsistencies that used to slip past me. I didn't confront. I didn't react. I observed. There was a moment late one night when I sat alone in the living room. The house completely silent around me. Kevin was upstairs. Hannah had left hours ago. Everything looked exactly the same. And yet I knew something wasn't. That was the first time I admitted it to myself. Without softening it. Without explaining it away. Something was wrong. Not just in my marriage. In the space between them. I didn't know what it was yet. But I knew it was real. And once I admitted that, everything changed. Because from that point on, I wasn't waiting for reassurance anymore. I was waiting for proof. I wasn't supposed to be home that early. The meeting had been canceled at the last minute. And instead of filling the time with something else, I drove straight back. I remember thinking how quiet the street looked when I pulled into the driveway. How ordinary everything seemed. Nothing about it warned me. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. Not empty. Occupied. I stood just inside the entryway for a second, listening. There was no music. No television. No obvious sound. Just a stillness that felt slightly disturbed. Like something had been paused rather than ended. Then I noticed the kitchen. 2 mugs sat on the counter. Not unusual on their own. But I hadn't used one that morning. And Kevin never used that second one unless we had someone over. They were still warm, I could tell without touching them. just from the faint steam still lingering in the air. Someone had been there. I walked a few steps forward. Slower now, my attention sharpening. Kevin's laptop was open on the island. The screen dimmed as I approached, then went dark completely. He never left it open like that unless he planned to come right back. "Kevin," I called out. There was a pause. Not long, just long enough. Then his voice came from the living room. "Yeah, hey, I'm here." Too quick. Too controlled. I turned the corner into the living room and saw him standing near the couch. His posture just slightly too straight, like he had been sitting and stood up too fast. And then, a second later, Hannah stepped out from the hallway. "I didn't hear you come in," she said. Her tone light, almost casual. Of course she didn't. I hadn't expected her to be there. I looked at both of them. Taking in the scene? Nothing obvious. Nothing I could point to. They were fully dressed. Composed? Standing at a distance that suggested nothing inappropriate. Everything looked normal. That was the problem. "What are you doing here?" I asked, directing the question at Hannah, keeping my voice even. She smiled. "Just slightly. I stopped by to drop something off for your dad," she said. "Kevin said he could take a look at something for me while I was here." Kevin nodded quickly. "Yeah, just helping her with a few things. Tech stuff." It made sense. Of course it did. It always did. I glanced back toward the kitchen, toward the mugs, then back at them. Something didn't line up. Not in a way I could explain. Not in a way I could challenge. But I felt it. There was a stiffness in the air, like both of them were aware of something I wasn't supposed to see, or wasn't supposed to question. "Okay," I said after a moment, forcing a small nod. Neither of them moved right away. That was another detail I noticed. They stayed where they were, like they were waiting for something. For me to react, for me to say more. I didn't. Instead, I walked past them into the kitchen, picking up one of the mugs. It was still warm, fresh. I set it back down carefully. Behind me, I could feel their attention, even without turning around. Kevin spoke first. "You're home early. Meeting got canceled," I said. Another pause. Then Hannah stepped closer. Just slightly, her voice soft. "I was just about to head out anyway," she said. "Didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," I replied. But I didn't turn to face her when I said it. I stayed focused on the counter, on the details in front of me, because it was easier than trying to read their expressions. There was a moment where none of us said anything. Then Kevin cleared his throat. "Everything's fine," he added, almost as an afterthought. That was the first thing that didn't belong. I hadn't asked if everything was fine. And yet he felt the need to say it. I turned slightly then, just enough to look at him. "I didn't say it wasn't," I replied. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he forced a smile. "Just saying." Hannah let out a small laugh, light and practiced. "See? Nothing suspicious," she said. The word hung there. Suspicious. No one had used that word until she did. I held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then I looked away. "Right," I said quietly. They moved quickly after that. Hannah gathered her things. Kevin walked her to the door. And within a few minutes, the house was empty again. Or at least, it looked that way. I stood in the kitchen long after they left, staring at the space they had just occupied, replaying every second, every word, every pause. It wasn't what they said. It was how easily they said it, how quickly the explanations came, how aligned they were without needing to check with each other. That kind of coordination doesn't happen by accident. I walked over to the sink and rinsed out one of the mugs, watching the water run over it, steady and quiet. Then I stopped, because there was something else, a small detail I had almost missed. Kevin's phone was sitting on the counter now, face down. He never left it behind. Not anymore. For a moment, I just looked at it. I didn't pick it up. I didn't touch it. But I noticed that was the difference. I wasn't ignoring things anymore. I turned away from the counter and walked slowly toward the hallway, my mind already working through what I had just seen. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was something, and more importantly, it confirmed what I had been trying not to admit. This wasn't in my head. Something had already started. I just didn't know how far it had gone. But I was going to find out. And this time, I wasn't going to look away. It happened at night. Not suddenly. Not loudly. Just inevitably. Kevin was already in the kitchen when I walked in, leaning against the counter like he had been waiting. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels deliberate. Like something has been cleared to make space for a conversation that can't be avoided anymore. "I think we should talk," he said. Of course we should. I stepped into the room slowly, taking my usual place across from him. The same spot where everything had started to unravel. The same counter. The same light overhead. The same stillness pressing in from every direction. But this time, I wasn't waiting for answers. I was waiting for confirmation. Kevin exhaled, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that looked practiced rather than nervous. "I don't want to drag this out," he said. "It's better if I just say it." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I love Hannah. There it was. Not hesitation. Not uncertainty. A statement. I've been in love with her for a while now. For a while, I let the words settle. Not because they surprised me, but because they connected every moment I had replayed in my head. Every glance. Every shift in behavior, it all aligned now. Cleanly. Precisely. "So it wasn't recent," I said, my voice steady. Kevin shook his head slightly. No. That single word carried more weight than anything else he had said. Not recent meant planned. Not recent meant every normal day we had lived through had already been something else underneath. I nodded once, absorbing it. The kitchen felt colder. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he continued, though his tone suggested he had accepted exactly how it had happened. "But it's not something I can ignore anymore." Of course not. Because he hadn't been ignoring it. He had been building it. "How long?" I asked. He hesitated. Just for a second. Then he gave me a time frame. Long enough that I could immediately map it onto memories I had already started questioning. Dinners. Conversations. Late nights. It wasn't just overlap. It was a second life running parallel to mine. I looked at him. Really looked at him this time. And realized something that settled deeper than the betrayal itself. He wasn't conflicted. He was resolved. That's what made it final. "I've already filed for divorce," he said. There it was again. Not something we would discuss. Something already done. He watched me carefully after he said it. Waiting. Still waiting for something. But the reaction he expected never came. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him why. I didn't say Hannah's name again. Instead, I listened. Because the more he spoke, the clearer it became. "This is better for both of us," he added. "Dragging things out would just make it worse. Better for both of us." I almost smiled at that. There's something unsettling about how easily people can redefine reality when they need to. "And the finances?" I asked quietly. He shifted slightly, his posture tightening for the first time since the conversation began. "I've already taken care of everything," he said. The same line. But now, in this moment, it carried more weight, more intention. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means things are already organized," he replied, his tone flattening. "You won't have to worry about anything." "You won't have to worry." That was the second time he had said something like that. And just like before, it didn't sound reassuring. It sounded dismissive. Like a conclusion he had already reached without me. I held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something: uncertainty, guilt, hesitation. There was none. Just calculation. That's when it became clear. This wasn't just a man leaving his marriage. This was a man who had already rearranged his life before telling me it was over. I felt something shift inside me again. Not pain, Not anger. Clarity. The kind that doesn't rush. The kind that doesn't react. You've planned this, I said. It wasn't a question. Kevin didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He just looked at me, as if the answer didn't matter anymore. I didn't want it to get messy, he said. Of course he didn't. Because messy would mean uncertainty. And he had removed uncertainty from his side of the equation. I nodded slowly. Then I stepped back. Not dramatically. Not in a way that marked the moment. Just enough to create distance. I understand, I said. It wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement. Kevin seemed to relax slightly at that, as if something had gone the way he expected. That was his mistake. Because what he saw as acceptance wasn't... I turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. No argument. No confrontation. No attempt to stop him. The hallway felt longer than usual as I moved through it. The silence behind me heavier now, but no longer confusing. I went upstairs, into the bedroom, and closed the door. This time, I didn't sit in the dark. I turned on the light. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the screen for a moment before doing anything. Not because I didn't know what to do. Because I did. That was the difference. I didn't need to understand his feelings. I needed to understand his actions. Every transfer, every decision, every step he had taken before standing in that kitchen and saying those words. Because if this was planned, then there would be a trail. And if there was a trail, I would find it. I opened the first account. Scrolled. Looked. Not reacting. Just observing. Because this wasn't the moment I lost my marriage. That had already happened. This was the moment I started seeing clearly. And once you see clearly, you stop asking what happened. You start asking what was done. And more importantly, what you're going to do next. The next morning didn't feel different. That was the strangest part. The same sunlight filtered through the blinds. The same coffee machine clicked on. The same quiet house held its shape like nothing had shifted beneath it. But everything had... I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, my coffee untouched, and logged into our joint account. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. The balance was lower than I expected, but not dramatically so. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have accepted it without question. But I wasn't that person anymore. I scrolled. Transaction by transaction. Dates. Amounts. Descriptions. It didn't take long before something started to feel structured. Not random spending. Not a sudden withdrawal. Movement. Small transfers at first. Amounts just large enough to matter, but not large enough to stand out immediately. Spread out over weeks. Then months. I leaned back slightly, narrowing my focus. This wasn't impulsive. This was paced. Planned. I opened another tab and checked the savings account. Same pattern. Different numbers. The realization didn't hit all at once. It built, piece by piece. As the pattern became clearer, he hadn't moved everything at once. He had been moving it gradually, quietly. Long before he stood in that kitchen and told me he was leaving. I went further. Credit card statements. Scrolling through charges I had once ignored. Restaurants I didn't remember going to. Locations that didn't match my schedule. Purchases that had been small enough to dismiss at the time, but now stood out against everything else. One charge caught my attention. A date I remembered clearly. I had been home that night, working late, finishing a design for a client. Kevin had said he was at the office. The charge wasn't near his office. It was somewhere else. Somewhere I had never been. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting that settle. Not shock. Confirmation. I wasn't uncovering something new. I was seeing what had already been there. I opened another statement. Then another. Each one adding a piece to something that no longer felt like a possibility. It was a system. Kevin hadn't just been hiding money. He had been redistributing it. Carefully enough to avoid immediate detection. Consistently enough to build something separate. I closed my eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. He didn't just leave me. He used me. Used our accounts, our structure, our trust. And for the first time since all of this started, I felt something sharper than clarity. Violation. Not emotional. Structural, like something fundamental had been taken apart without my consent. I opened a new folder on my desktop. No name. No label. Just a space. Then I started saving everything. Screenshots first. Account summaries. Transaction histories. Anything that showed movement. Then I downloaded full statements. Organized them by date. Labeled them in a way that only made sense to me. I wasn't reacting. I was building. Every file I saved made the situation feel less abstract. Less emotional. More defined. Something I could work with. I checked the timestamps on the transfers again. Cross-referenced them with dates I remembered. Dinners. Visits. Conversations. The overlaps weren't accidental. They were consistent. Which meant something else. Hannah wasn't just part of the outcome. She was part of the process. I sat back again, staring at the screen. Why now? Why move everything before telling me? Why not wait? Unless, this wasn't just about leaving. It was about positioning, setting things up before I had a chance to respond. Before I even knew there was something to respond to. I opened my email and searched for anything connected to shared accounts. Notifications. Updates. Changes. Most of them had already been read. Dismissed. Filed away at the time as routine. Now they looked different. Patterns inside patterns. I picked up my phone and opened my notes. Started writing. Dates. Amounts. Connections. I didn't try to make sense of all of it at once. I just recorded, because understanding comes later. First, you collect. That was something I understood instinctively now. From the hallway, I heard movement. Kevin. He was awake. I closed the laptop halfway. Not completely. Just enough to make it look casual. Footsteps approached. He walked into the kitchen like nothing had changed. Morning, he said. Morning, I replied, my voice steady. He poured himself coffee, avoiding looking at my screen. Everything okay? He asked. I glanced up at him. Yes, that was all I said. And it was enough. Because I saw it then. The assumption, he believed I didn't know. Or at least, not enough. That was his second mistake. I lowered my gaze back to the laptop, scrolling slowly, deliberately, like I was just checking something routine. Not reacting, not questioning, just existing in the same space. Until he left the room. Only then did I open the laptop fully again. There was one more step. I opened a browser tab and searched for a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. Someone who understood financial cases, asset movement, strategic behavior. It didn't take long to find a name. Austin, 39. Experienced. Focused on cases that weren't straightforward. That was what I needed. I didn't call immediately. I saved the number. Closed the tab. Because timing matters. And I wasn't done yet. I looked back at the screen one more time. At the numbers. The patterns. The structure he thought was invisible. It wasn't. Not anymore. Because now I knew what I was looking at. This wasn't just betrayal. It was preparation. And if he had been preparing all this time, then I had something he didn't. Time to prepare back. It wasn't chaos. That was the first thing I understood as I kept going through the numbers. It was coordination. I sat at my desk later that night. The house quiet again. My laptop glowing in the dim light. What had started as a few irregular transactions had become something else entirely. A pattern I could follow. And once I followed it, it led somewhere very specific. The transfers weren't random amounts. They were calculated, just small enough to avoid attention. Just frequent enough to build something over time. Each one placed carefully, spaced out across weeks and months. I zoomed in on one sequence. 3 transfers within 10 days. Different amounts, different descriptions, but all routed through the same secondary account. I didn't recognize that account. Not at first. But I kept tracing it, scrolling back, cross-referencing dates. Then I saw it. One of those transfers matched a night I remembered clearly. Hannah had been over. I leaned back slowly, letting the realization settle. That wasn't coincidence. That was alignment. I opened another tab and started digging deeper into older records. It took time. It wasn't obvious. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. The transfers increased during certain periods. And those periods lined up with something else. Hannah's presence. Not every time, but enough. Enough to form a pattern. My chest tightened slightly. Not from shock, but from the precision of it. They weren't reacting. They were executing. I opened a spreadsheet and started mapping it out. Dates on one side, transfers on the other. Then I added a third column. Hannah. Visits. Calls. Events I could remember. The connections didn't appear all at once. They built. Quietly. But once they were there, I couldn't ignore them. I stared at the screen for a long moment. This wasn't just an affair. This was something structured. Something intentional. I shifted my focus. If this was planned, then there had to be a reason beyond just them. People don't move money like this for emotion. They move it for outcome. I opened a new window and searched for anything connected to Hannah. Public records. Professional profiles. Articles. Her marketing work was easy to find. Campaigns. Clients. Partnerships. She had always presented herself as successful. But success doesn't always mean stability. I kept digging. Older references. Mentions. A failed campaign surfaced, buried deep enough that it didn't show up immediately. A project that had been pulled. Investors backing out. Clients shifting away. The timeline caught my attention. It lined up. Not perfectly, but closely enough. Shortly after that, she started appearing more often in our lives. More involved. More present. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Need. That was what it looked like. And Kevin had access. Not just to money. To structure. To accounts. To me. I sat there, staring at the connection. Letting it form completely. Hannah needed stability. Kevin had resources. And I was the bridge. I went back to the financial records. This time, I wasn't just looking at movement. I was looking at intent. And then I found something that shifted everything again. A saved file. Not in the main folders. Not in anything obvious. Buried. But not hidden well enough. It wasn't labeled clearly. Just a generic name. I opened it. It wasn't explicit. No direct statements. No obvious plan laid out. But the language was enough. References to timelines. To transitions. To separation phases. My eyes moved slowly across the screen. This wasn't documentation of something that had happened. This was preparation for something that hadn't. At least, not yet. I closed the file and leaned back, exhaling slowly. So that was it. This wasn't about falling in love. This wasn't about something unexpected. This was about positioning. About building an exit that benefited them. And leaving me where I couldn't respond in time. I let my head fall back against the chair, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, everything felt very still. Then something shifted again. Not emotionally. Mentally. I opened a new folder. This one I named Dates. Files. Connections. I copied everything into it. Every document. Every screenshot. Every piece of the timeline I had built. Organized. Structured. Controlled. I didn't rush. I didn't skip anything. Because this wasn't about reacting. This was about building something stronger than what they thought they had created. I checked the time. Late. The house was quiet. Kevin was upstairs. Still moving through this like everything was under control. Like I was still the same person I had been before he said those words. That was his mistake. Because the moment I understood the pattern, everything changed. He thought I didn't know. He thought I didn't see. And that gave me something he didn't have. Advantage. I closed the laptop halfway. Just enough to pause. Not enough to stop. Sat there in the quiet, letting the full picture settle into place. Affair. Money. Timing. All connected. All intentional. They didn't just want each other. They wanted a clean exit. One that left them with everything they thought they deserved. I opened the laptop again. Looked at the timeline one more time. And for the first time since this began, I stopped asking what was happening. Because I already knew, now there was only one question left. What was I going to do about it? Kevin reached out 3 days later. Not with an apology. Not with hesitation. With a message that sounded measured. Almost professional. We should talk. About everything. Of course we should. I didn't answer right away. I let the message sit. Unread. Even though I had already seen it. Timing mattered now. Everything did. When I finally responded, it was short. Okay. He suggested we meet at the house. Neutral ground, he called it. There was nothing neutral about it anymore. He was already there when I arrived. Sitting at the dining table, a folder in front of him, his posture straight. Composed, the same version of himself he had shown me in the kitchen. Controlled. Certain. You look good, he said as I walked in. I didn't respond to that. Instead, I took a seat across from him and waited. He opened the folder slowly, like he was about to present something important. I think it's best if we handle this cleanly, he began. No unnecessary conflict. No drawn-out process. Clean. That word again. He slid a few papers across the table toward me. A settlement, he said. Fair for both of us. I didn't touch them right away. I just looked at him. Go ahead, he added. Take a look. So I did. The numbers were neat. Organized. Structured in a way that made them look reasonable at first glance. A portion of the house. A limited share of the savings. Specific accounts excluded entirely. I scanned it once. Then again. Slower this time. Because now I knew what I was looking at. This isn't accurate, I said calmly. Kevin leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. It's fair, he replied. Given the situation, I almost asked him what situation he meant. The one he created, or the one he thought I didn't understand. You don't want this to get complicated, he continued. Legal fees alone will eat into everything. This is the easiest way. There it was. Not a suggestion. A direction. I kept my eyes on the paper. You've already moved assets, I said. It wasn't a question. There was a pause. Small, but real. I've organized things, he corrected. Of course he did. From the hallway, I heard movement. Then Hannah stepped into the room. She didn't look surprised to see me. Of course she didn't. I didn't realize you'd be here already, she said. Her voice soft, almost careful. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. Kevin didn't seem bothered by her presence. If anything, it seemed planned. We're just trying to keep things simple, he said, as if that explained everything. Hannah stepped closer, standing slightly behind him, just enough to be present without fully inserting herself. I know this is difficult, she added, but dragging it out will only make it worse. Her tone was gentle, measured, almost sympathetic, but there was something underneath it. Alignment. She wasn't trying to comfort me. She was reinforcing him. I looked up from the papers and met her eyes. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I looked back down, because what mattered wasn't what they were saying. It was how they were saying it. Together, you've both thought this through, I said. Kevin didn't respond. Hannah didn't either. They didn't need to. It was obvious. Kevin leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting. This is the best outcome for everyone, he said. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. There was something new in his voice now. Not just control. Pressure. Subtle, but deliberate. And if I don't agree? I asked. He held my gaze for a second longer this time. Then we go through the process, he said. And that can get uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. That was his word for it. Not unfair. Not wrong. Uncomfortable. A warning without specifics. A threat without details. I folded the papers neatly and set them back on the table. I'm not discussing this without legal representation, I said. The words landed quietly, but the shift was immediate. Kevin's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. A crack. You don't need a lawyer for this, he said. I do. There was no hesitation in my voice. No uncertainty. Just a statement. Hannah shifted slightly behind him, her composure tightening. It doesn't have to turn into that, she said. We can resolve this privately. I looked at her again. This time, I didn't look away quickly. This is already past private, I replied. Silence followed. Kevin exhaled sharply, leaning back again. But this time the control wasn't as clean. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, he said. No, I answered calmly. I'm making sure it's accurate. That was the difference. He wanted speed. I wanted truth. And speed only matters when you're trying to stay ahead of something. I stood up slowly, pushing the chair back just enough to signal the end of the conversation. You can speak to my attorney, I said. Kevin's jaw tightened. That was the first real reaction I had seen from him since everything started. He hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. Hannah didn't say anything this time. But I could see it. The shift. The moment where the balance tilted. Even slightly. Because they had been moving forward under one assumption. That I didn't know enough to fight back. And now, that assumption was gone. I turned and walked toward the door without waiting for a response. Behind me, I could feel the tension settle into the room. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just different. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. I stepped into it anyway. Because for the first time since all of this began, something had become clear. They weren't trying to be fair. They were trying to finish this. Before I understood everything. I arrived early. The mediation office was quieter than I expected. The kind of quiet that doesn't belong to comfort, but to structure. Glass walls, muted colors, a receptionist who barely looked up. Everything felt controlled. Deliberate. I liked that. Because I was too. Austin was already there when I walked in, standing near the conference room with a folder in his hand. He didn't smile. Didn't offer anything unnecessary. Just a nod. You're ready? He said. Not a question. Yes, I replied. He opened the door, and we stepped inside. Kevin was already seated on the opposite side of the table. His lawyer sat beside him, papers neatly arranged. And next to them, Hannah. She wasn't supposed to be there. At least, not officially. But she was. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just Kevin's decision. It never had been. I took my seat across from them, Austin beside me, placing his folder on the table with quiet precision. No one spoke for a moment. Then Kevin's lawyer began. He spoke in calm, measured tones, outlining a narrative that sounded clean and reasonable on the surface. A marriage that had naturally deteriorated. A desire for a fair and efficient resolution. An emphasis on avoiding unnecessary conflict. I listened. Not to respond. To observe. Because underneath the language, there was something else. Minimization. Carefully framed. Emily contributed. But Kevin carried the financial weight. Assets were adjusted prior to separation. Everything positioned as if it had already been resolved. As if I had already agreed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. Because Austin didn't move either. He let them finish. Let the room settle. Let the narrative sit exactly where they wanted it. And then he spoke. Not louder. Not sharper. Just clearer. We'd like to review the financial activity leading up to the filing, he said. That was it. No accusation. No emotion. Just direction. Kevin shifted slightly in his chair. His lawyer nodded. Still composed. Of course, he said. Austin opened his folder. The first document slid across the table. Transfer records, he said. From joint accounts. Simple. Clean. Undeniable. The mediator leaned forward slightly, eyes moving across the page. Kevin didn't move at first. Then his hand shifted. Just slightly, resting closer to the table. Austin didn't pause. He placed another document down. A pattern, he continued. Multiple transfers over an extended period. Structured amounts. Consistent timing. Now Kevin looked. Really looked. And something changed. Not outwardly, but enough. The second document followed. Credit usage tied to those periods, Austin said. Locations inconsistent with shared activity. I didn't look at Kevin. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The shift. The moment where control started slipping. Hannah's posture tightened beside him. She had been composed when we entered. Controlled. Present. Now her hands were folded too tightly in her lap. Austin turned another page. This aligns with documented interactions between Mr. Kevin and Ms. Hannah, he said. The room went still. Not quiet. Still. Because now it wasn't just financial. It was connected. Kevin leaned forward abruptly. This doesn't prove anything, he said. There it was. The first crack. Not denial. Not explanation. Reaction. Austin didn't look at him. He didn't engage. He simply placed the next document on the table. A timeline, he said. Dates. Transfers. Interactions. Side by side. Clean. Structured. Complete. The mediator's expression changed. Subtly. But enough. Kevin's lawyer shifted now. His composure still intact. But his tone different. We'll need to review these in detail, he said. Of course they would. Because now they had something to respond to. Before, they had a narrative. Now they had evidence. Kevin looked at me then. For the first time since we sat down, not with confidence, not with control, with calculation, trying to understand how much I knew, how far I had gone. I met his gaze. Calm. Still, unmoved. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he looked away. Hannah didn't speak. She couldn't. Because whatever role she had prepared to play in this room, it no longer fit. The mediator cleared his throat softly. I think it would be helpful to take a short break, he said. No one disagreed. We stood. Chairs shifting quietly against the floor. The room emptied in pieces. Outside. Austin didn't say much. He didn't need to. They didn't expect this, he said finally. No, I replied. They thought they were ahead. I nodded slightly. They were, I said, just not anymore. He looked at me for a moment, then gave a small, almost approving nod. Inside, Kevin stood near the window, his back partially turned, his posture no longer as controlled as it had been. Hannah was beside him. But there was distance now. Subtle, but real. They weren't aligned anymore. Not the way they had been. Because alignment depends on certainty. And certainty had just been taken from them. I watched them for a moment longer. Then I looked away. Because I didn't need to see anything else. For the first time since that night in the kitchen, Kevin understood something he hadn't before. He hadn't finished this. He had just started something he couldn't control. It was quiet after that. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that settles after something has already shifted. I sat in my car outside the mediation office for a few minutes longer than necessary, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, watching people move in and out of the building like nothing had changed. For them, it hadn't. For me, everything had. Austin had been clear. The outcome wasn't final yet, but the direction was. The evidence had landed exactly where it needed to. Kevin's position had weakened. The narrative he had built, clean, controlled, efficient, was no longer holding. You're in a strong position, Austin had said before we parted. Very strong. It wasn't said to reassure me. It was a fact. And yet, as I drove home, I didn't feel what I expected to feel. No rush of victory. No sense of satisfaction. Just clarity. Clean. Quiet clarity. Because winning something like that doesn't give you back what was taken. It just confirms that you weren't wrong to see it clearly. When I got home, the house felt different again. Not hostile. Not heavy. Just temporary. Like a place I was already beginning to move past. Even if I hadn't physically left yet. I set my bag down, walked into the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. My movements felt automatic. Steady, as if my body understood something my mind was still catching up to. That's when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Austin. I answered immediately. Hi. His tone was the same as always. Direct. Controlled. I need to let you know about something, he said. There was a pause. Not long, but enough to shift the air around me. It's regarding your father. I didn't sit down. I didn't move at all. What about him? I asked. He passed away, Austin said. The words didn't hit all at once. They settled. Slowly. My grip on the glass tightened slightly, but I didn't drop it. How? I asked quietly. Medical complications, he replied. It was recent. Recent? I closed my eyes for a moment. Not in shock. Not in disbelief. But in something more complicated than either of those. My relationship with my father had already been distant. Quiet. Filtered through years of changes I never fully addressed. And now, whatever remained of that was gone. I'm sorry, Austin added. I nodded. Even though he couldn't see it. Thank you, I said. There was another pause. Then his tone shifted. Just slightly. There's something else, he said. Of course there's a will, he continued. It's already been reviewed. I leaned against the counter, grounding myself. Okay. You are listed as the primary beneficiary. The words landed differently this time. Sharper. More immediate. I didn't speak right away. Everything? I asked. Yes, he said. Assets. Properties. Holdings. It's all structured under your name. I let that settle. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did completely. And Hannah? I asked. There was no hesitation in his answer. She's not included. The silence that followed was heavier than anything else. Not because it was surprising. Because it wasn't. Not anymore. Nothing. I pressed. No, Austin said. No direct allocation. No shared claim. I exhaled slowly, setting the glass down on the counter. That explained something. Not everything, but enough. Was this recent? I asked. The will was updated prior to his passing, he said. Within a time frame that suggests intentional revision. Intentional. Of course it was. I looked out toward the window, my reflection faint in the glass. For a moment, everything aligned. Hannah's timing, her presence, the financial pressure, Kevin's sudden urgency. It hadn't just been about leaving. It had been about what came after, what they thought was coming. They didn't know, I said, more to myself than to him. No, Austin replied. It doesn't appear they did. I almost smiled. Not out of satisfaction, out of understanding. They had built their entire exit on an assumption that Hannah would gain something, that Kevin would be part of that leaving me positioned them closer to what they wanted. And that assumption was wrong. I'll send you the documents, Austin said. We can discuss next steps when you're ready. Okay, I replied. We ended the call. I stood there for a long moment after, the phone still in my hand, the kitchen quiet around me. This time, the silence felt different. Not empty, not uncertain, complete. Because now, everything made sense. The affair, the money, the timing. It wasn't just betrayal. It was calculation. But their calculation had been based on something they didn't control. And that was where it broke. I set my phone down and walked slowly into the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was catching up to something. I was ahead. And for the first time, I understood something clearly enough that it didn't need to be questioned. They thought they had taken everything from me, but they had built their future on something that was never going to be theirs. The days after that felt unusually quiet, not because nothing was happening, but because I had stopped reacting to it. I moved through my routine the same way I always had: coffee in the morning, emails, design work, calls, but there was a distance now. A layer between me and everything else that hadn't been there before. Control. That was the difference. I hadn't told Kevin anything. Not about the will. Not about my father. Not about what I now understood. And I wasn't going to. Power doesn't need to announce itself. It waits. It watches. It lets other people reveal themselves first. I didn't have to wait long. It came in the form of a phone call. His name lit up on my screen in the middle of the afternoon. Kevin. I stared at it for a second before answering. Hello? There was a pause on the other end. Then his voice. Hey. Different. Not the same tone from the kitchen. Not the same controlled distance from mediation. This one was careful, measured in a different way. We should talk, he said. Of course. We've already talked, I replied. Not like this, he said quickly. There are still things we need to figure out. Things? I leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting toward the window. What things? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. I heard about your father, he said. There it was. Not direct, but close enough. I didn't respond. I'm sorry, he added. I didn't know how to bring it up. That wasn't why he was calling. We both knew that. You don't have to, I said. The silence stretched again, heavier now. I think we should meet, he continued. There are still details that need to be discussed. Details. That word again. Clean. Efficient. Controlled. Except this time, it didn't sound like control. It sounded like adjustment. What kind of details? I asked. His voice shifted slightly. I think things moved too fast, he said. Maybe we didn't handle everything the right way? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. You handled everything exactly the way you wanted to, I said. That's not what I mean, he replied quickly. I mean, maybe we should revisit some of it. Revisit. There it was. The real reason. He didn't say the word money. He didn't need to. You filed for divorce, I said calmly. You moved assets. You made decisions. I know, he said. And I'm not saying that was wrong. I'm just saying maybe we can find a better outcome for both of us. Better. For both of us. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. Then I spoke. No. Just one word. Simple. Final. He didn't respond immediately. I could hear him breathing on the other end. Slower now. More deliberate. You're not even willing to talk about it, he asked. We've already talked about it, I said again. That was before, he replied. Exactly. That was before. Before he knew. Before everything he thought he had secured had shifted. I think you're making a mistake, he added, his tone tightening. I didn't react, because that was the same tone he had used before, when he thought he was still in control. Maybe, I said. But it's my mistake to make. That stopped him. Completely. For a moment. There was nothing. No argument. No pushback. Just silence. Then, quieter this time. I didn't expect you to be like this. I looked down at my desk, at the sketches spread out in front of me. I didn't expect you to be either, I replied. That was the closest thing to honesty I had given him. And it was enough. He didn't call back after that. But he tried. Messages at first. Short. Neutral. Then longer. More personal. Mentions of things we used to share. Places we had been. Conversations we had once had. It wasn't about us. It was about access. And I didn't respond. Not once. A few days later, I heard from someone else. A mutual connection. Casual conversation. Carefully worded. Hannah hadn't received anything. No assets. No claim. No security. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them, because I already knew what that meant. Whatever had existed between them, whatever alignment they had built, it wasn't the same anymore. It couldn't be. Because it had been built on something that no longer existed. Expectation. I imagined them together for a moment. The conversations, the realization, the shift. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just slow. Unraveling. The same way everything else had. Kevin called one more time after that. Late. His voice was different again. Less controlled. Less certain. I just want to talk, he said. Not we need to. That was new. I let the call go to voicemail. I didn't listen to it. I didn't need to, because whatever he was going to say, I had already heard enough. Closure isn't something you give someone, it's something you take, and I had already taken mine. The last message he sent was shorter. Simpler. I'm sorry. I read it once. Then I deleted it. Not out of anger. Not out of resentment. Because it didn't change anything. And it didn't belong to me anymore. That was the last time I heard from him. And for the first time since all of this began, the silence felt like freedom. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the heavy kind that presses on your chest, but the kind that settles around you like something you've finally chosen. My new apartment was smaller than the house I had left behind, but it felt different in a way that mattered more. The light came in softer. The space felt intentional. Mine. I woke up that morning without thinking about what had been taken from me. That was new. I made coffee slowly, standing by the window, watching the street below come to life. People moving, cars passing, the rhythm of a world that had nothing to do with what I had been through. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was catching up to anything. I felt present. Work came back into focus gradually. At first, it was just small projects, familiar clients, designs I could complete without thinking too much. But over time, it shifted. I became more selective, more intentional about who I worked with, what I created, how I spent my time. I wasn't trying to rebuild what I had lost. I was building something new, something that didn't depend on anyone else's decisions. There were still moments, of course, late at night, when the apartment was too quiet, or when something small, a song, a phrase, a memory would surface without warning. I didn't ignore them, but I didn't let them stay. Healing didn't happen all at once. It happened in decisions, in choosing not to revisit what no longer belonged to me, in choosing to move forward without needing an explanation that would never be enough. I heard about Kevin and Hannah once. Not directly, just in passing. They were still together. That didn't surprise me. What did, in a way, was how little it mattered. There was a time when I would have tried to imagine their life, measure it against what we had, look for signs that it wasn't working. I don't do that anymore, because whatever exists between them now, it no longer includes me. And that's the point. I don't need their story to validate mine. I don't need their outcome to justify what I went through. There's a kind of freedom in that. Not forgiving them, not forgetting, just releasing the need to carry it. I used to think strength looked like fighting back, proving something, making sure they understood what they had done. Now I understand something different. Composure is strength. Silence is strength. Walking away without needing them to see it is strength. Because in the end, people don't always face consequences the way you expect. Sometimes, they just live with the decisions they made. And sometimes, that's enough. I learned that the hard way. That truth hurts, but confusion hurts longer. And once you see clearly, once you understand what was really happening, you don't go back to the version of yourself that needed reassurance. You become someone else. Not someone better. Just someone who knows, who notices, who chooses differently. There's a moment I think about sometimes, standing in that kitchen, hearing those words for the first time. I love your stepmother. I choose her. At the time, it felt like something was ending. And it was. But it wasn't what I thought. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of a version of me that believed time alone could protect something. Now, when I think about that moment, it feels different. Quieter. More distant. Because what followed mattered more. The decisions I made after. The way I chose to respond. The way I chose to move forward without losing myself in the process. His biggest mistake wasn't leaving me. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was underestimating what I would become after. I didn't collapse. I didn't chase. I didn't try to fix something that had already been broken long before I saw it. I stepped back. I looked. And then I chose. If you've ever been in a moment like that, where everything shifts without warning, where the person you trusted becomes someone you don't recognize, you know how easy it is to react, to fight, to hold on. But sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is none of that. Sometimes, it's stepping into the silence and deciding who you are without them. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had to walk away from something you thought would last, I'd really like to hear your experience. What would you have done in my place? And if you're still in that moment right now, what's the one thing you're starting to see clearly? You can share it below. And if stories like this, real, complicated, and honest, mean something to you, stay with me. Because there are more stories like this. Some even harder to tell. And sometimes, hearing them is exactly what reminds you, you're not the only one who made it through. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.